Okay, good morning. So actually, we'll do the normal format, which is I'll start off muting everyone, but please feel free to unmute yourselves if you so wish, just to makes it avoid side noise. We were looking at the concepts of the Yudkim and Ikrim, the 13 fundamentals of faith. 2 weeks ago, we discussed some of the discussion around these principles of faith, disagreements with the concept, or perhaps quibbles around the details of what's included or not included in these principles. But last week we sort of stepped back and became a little clearer about what the very concept of a principle faith means in the thinking of the Rambam. And in view of the Rambam, the idea of a principle of faith is this defines the parameters of what is Judaism. Meaning, say, if I happen to miss out a particular piece of information, I don't know the story of the Meraglim, I don't know about Korach, these week's Sedras that we're reading at the moment, I just happen not to have learned them. So the religion I believe in, and I am part of, is still Judaism, and I'm missing a piece of information. If I happen not to have learned that God is one, then that's just a different belief system I believe in. It's not just any old piece of information. It's one of the pieces of information that defines the parameters of Judaism, of what we mean by belief in Judaism and being a member of, in the Rambam's understanding, being a member of Yisrael within the rule of Kol Yisrael Yeshalom Chelek L'Olam Haba, the idea that every Jewish person has a portion in the world to come. Now, some of these beliefs are more obvious and some of them are less obvious. It's clearer why belief in one God, or belief in the Torah of Moshe, or perhaps belief in reward and punishment, why these are fundamentals of faith. They're not just any old information. They're not just a story that happens to be in the Torah, which if you don't know, you're missing a piece of Torah, but you're not, someone's never heard about Pesach. They still believe in Judaism. They're just missing an important mitzvah. They've never heard about the flood. They're missing an important story, but it's not core to what we mean by Judaism. But if they haven't heard of the giving of the Torah, they haven't heard of reward and punishment, it's missing something that is the framework of what we mean by this faith, which is Judaism. So this is view of the Rambam, and some of them are obvious why they're included in that. Others one can question, and that's what we discussed in previous weeks. Is it from the core of Judaism? Isn't it? Of course, it's what Judaism says, but if you happen not to have known it, what does it matter so much? And similarly, the Rambam lists as one of his principles of faith the belief that everything in the Torah, that we now possess, is this is Ikka, principle number 7, the prophecy of Moshe is all true. And principle number 8, all the Torah that we possess is that which was given to Moshe. So one does have to believe that everything in the Torah is true, but that only means if one knows that the Torah tells us the story of Korach and I say I don't believe in it, that would then fall foul of this principle. If I happen not to have heard of it, it wouldn't be a problem. We therefore, based on that, contrasted the principle of Reb Chaim Brisker, in which he reads the Rambam to be saying that since this is the parameter of what we mean by Judaism, the fact that one happens not to know it isn't a relevant halachic consideration. The laws of mazid, deliberate transgression, shogeg, accidental transgression, ones, completely inadvertent transgression, where it's no responsibility of myself at all. And that makes sense when one's in the realm of regular mitzvahs and regular averos, whether they're mitzvahs of emotion, whether they're mitzvahs of thought, or whether they're mitzvahs of action. However, when it comes to principles of faith, it may be completely inadvertent. It may be even not at all one's responsibility, ones, that one doesn't know there's one God, but nonetheless, one doesn't. This is the phrase, the Yiddish phrase that they quoted, and that students of Chaim Brisker's quote in his name, never chanapikoros, is oichanapikoros, even someone who, through no fault of their own, is a never chanapikoros, but the fact is they're not believing in Judaism. It's some other faith they're believing in if they happen not to believe in God. That's one formulation. But we need to balance that with another idea of the Rambam, that the Rambam says in his laws of Mamrim, his Hilchos Mamrim, his laws of rebels, in which the Rambam says a tinuk shenishba, someone raised in a environment, a non-believing environment. The Rambam is talking about the context of the Karoim, the Karaites who don't believe in the Torah Sheba'al Peh, not the founding generations of the Tzedokim and Baisusim, of the Sadducees, not their immediate founders and their first generation students, but their grandchildren and great-grandchildren who have only ever grown up believing in the Sadducee outlook of life, the Tzedoki outlook of life. These, says the Rambam, are not apikosim, they're not heretics. Why? Because they are like a tinuk shenishma, they're like a child captured, brought up in the middle of nowhere, who knows nothing about Judaism whatsoever. This isn't a heretic. How do we resolve this with the idea that even someone who inadvertently doesn't believe, but the fact is they're simply not believing in the Torah and Judaism? One way of answering it is by focusing on this word tinuk. Someone who isn't in the framework, who hasn't conceptually considered in a realistic way the possibility of belief. Such a person is like literally like the child, like the baby. We wouldn't say all our babies are heretics because they don't believe in the 13 principles of faith. They're simply little babies. They haven't seriously considered this. They haven't had the intellectual faculty to form an opinion one way or another. And therefore, similarly, this person, this tinuk shenishba, this person brought up in the middle of nowhere, completely removed from any Jewish identity, completely unaware perhaps of their Jewish identity whatsoever, such a person is a tinuk shenishba. They have no seriously formulated view on the subject whatsoever. It's not that they are consciously disbelievers, albeit through no fault of their own, but they're not disbelievers at all. They're just haven't considered this in any serious way, much like a little baby, quite literally, isn't a non-believer, they're just an a-believer. They're not in the world of belief and emunah whatsoever. Now, I want to use this to try and share with you this week, and hopefully in this part of the series finish off this topic, how some of the contemporary poskim have applied this. And I should warn you, this doesn't line up in any of the standard battle lines that we might think that it normally does. So we may come into this topic with a sort of presumption that the different philosophies that people belong to along the Haredi or modern Orthodox spectrum or the Hasidic spectrum is going to affect their view on this topic. And we'll see it's not quite that simple. It doesn't align itself with the normal battlegrounds in contemporary Orthodoxy, in which we may assume that some branches of Orthodoxy are more open, some are less open. It actually cuts across the hashkafic spectrum and hashkafic framework in a very interesting way. Now, the first poskim to deal seriously with this subject in the modern age are the German poskim, for obvious reasons. Germany was the first large Jewish community to confront modernity. Italy confronted modernity, the Jewish community in Italy confronted modernity ahead of the German community, but by that stage it was not a powerful Torah community, and it didn't face the same sort of culture camp that ended up happening in Germany. The next communities to confront it were France, again nowhere near as powerful a Jewish community as Germany, Holland to some degree, and then it hit Germany. Germany, very big, large Jewish community, very strongly Orthodox initially, with great Gedolim, and this is the scene of the battleground where the first clashes occur, as we know, and therefore the first Gedolim and poskim to really address this issue. What actually is the status of, in their setting, Reform Jews and Jews who have chosen to leave Orthodoxy? The next series of poskim to confront this issue is Hungary, because Hungary is the next scene of the big battlegrounds. East Europe, classic East Europe, Poland, Ukraine, Russia, Lithuania, doesn't really ever, their halachic literature doesn't really en masse confront this issue, because even though between the wars there is a significant dropout rate, it's not a coherent sort of philosophical movement in the same way as it is in Western Europe. Many of the founding fathers and Maskilim are believers, very strong believers. They just want to modernize Judaism. So there's very fierce battles around these issues, but they're not philosophically and consistently and systematically denying principles of faith in the same way as is occurring in Western Europe. It was coming, it was on the way, but that part of Eastern European history never developed before the terrible destruction of East Europe. So we don't really have a systematic Eastern European response until we arrive in Eretz Yisrael, where already before the war, there one does have coherent philosophical objections to Judaism by some of the founding generation of the new Yishuv, the Yishuv HaChadash, the Zionist settlers, and then of course after the Second World War and post-independence in Israel, this is something that's discussed by the poskim. So that's roughly the lay of the land of which poskim address the issue. Now, there's an easy thing to say, well, relatively easy thing to say, and that is the third and fourth generation of non-believers. We already have the Rambam. The Rambam already tells us that the Tzaddikim and the Tzaddikim and Baisusim, the Sadducees, are not counted as non-believers because they're already brought up like this. These are Tinoka Shenishbu. They don't fall under the category of a heretic. So it would seem, though we will see there's some argument about this, that someone who is a second or third or fourth generation grown up secular or non-orthodox and denying some of the principles of faith wouldn't fall within this category according to the view of the Rambam. What, however, about the founding generation? So in Germany, in in the year 1850, people are beginning to confront modernity. Some are choosing to drop their orthodoxy. What is their halachic status? So the first posek, very, very significant posek to confront an analogous matter is Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger. Yaakov Ettlinger flourished between, well, he was born in the late 1700s, 1798, and died in the late 1800s, 1870s. Very, very important posek. He wrote the Aruch LaNer, he wrote the B'Korei Yaakov, world-class posek. He discusses the phenomena of Jews who have stopped keeping Shabbos. Now, this isn't quite the topic we're talking about. However, Germany's economy is modernizing, and more Jews are becoming professionals instead of running their own big or small businesses. Now, the challenge of becoming a professional is that you're under someone else's employ, and you're not running your own business. So pre his generation, Jews are largely traders, lenders, money exchangers, bankers, peddlers on the large and small scale. Some are very wealthy, some are very poor, but they're running their own businesses. In his generation, they get education, and we're not yet talking about someone who confronts reform systematically. That's to the provenance of his next generation, his students, the generation of Chacham Bainais and the generation of Samson Raphael Hirsch and Rabbi Israel Hildesheim and these legends. In his generation, there's not yet a systematic confrontation with reform, but there is a confrontation with Chilul Shabbos, because people have got educations, they've now become professionals, and they have pressure to work on Shabbos. And you end up with the first time the phenomena of people who perhaps go to shul, daven an early minyan shacharis on Shabbos, make a quick kiddush, have a bite to eat, and then they go off to work. And Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger wants to classify this halachically, because halach is very clear. Shabbos, someone who breaks Shabbos, as if they have denied the whole Torah. What on earth would lead a Jew to break Shabbos unless they are denying but one of the two or both of the pillars upon which Shabbos is built? Why do we keep Shabbos? In memory of the creation of the world and in memory of Egypt. So if you're not keeping Shabbos, you are very categorically and clearly stating, I don't believe in at least one, if not both, of these two pillars. Absolute heresy. Shabbos. Therefore, anyone who breaks Shabbos, ki'ilu kofa b'chol haTorah kula. And this was absolutely normative in the Jewish world until really the 1850s, when Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger discusses this. This was the standard assumption throughout medieval Europe and the early modern age. Of course, this is the halacha. Says Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger, this doesn't apply. A Jew who is going to shul Shabbos morning and is making kiddush and declaring in kiddush what we say in kiddush, and then going off to work, this is not someone who is choosing to break Shabbos. This is someone who is weak, someone who isn't standing up to their own values. But one doesn't see in this a clear repudiation of Shabbos, and therefore we cannot assume such a person is Mechal Shabbos. He says the first generation that does this, Lo Yadana Ma Odin Bahem. He says, I don't know how to paskin about them, because it's unclear to me how one gets into the mindset of what's going on. But then he says, but their children, that for sure, B'neim Asher Komu Tachteim, their children that descend from them. About this, I'm clear that they are Tinuk Shenishba and they are not heretics. So that's dealing with Shabbos, which is not quite the same thing as the principles of faith. We then have Reb David Sv Hofmann. He's the next generation of leaders. In fact, he's a generation and a half later. He's born in 1840s, dies in the 1920s. So he's a little younger even than, he's sort of half a generation younger than Samson Raphael Hirsch. He ends up his career as the Rosh Yeshiva in the Hildesheimer Yeshiva, the Hildesheimer Seminary in Berlin, and a very, very important posek who wrote a sefer called the Melamed Lahoyel, a very important halachic work, who deals with a lot of the questions around confronting modernity. And he records the minhag in Germany to allow Mechalei Shabbos even to be Bali Tefillah, to allow them even to daven for the Omid. He says we allow them to daven for the Omid because these people are not Kefrim. He says, I remember that once I found someone who was in Avelus and his shop was open on Shabbos in this particular case, and he was allowed to daven in front of the Omid because of this reasoning that in Germany the minhag developed not to keep someone not to view someone as a heretic because of Shabbos. And then he goes further and he talks about the Anoshim Shebe America. He said, I heard about the Jews in America who are really far. They are literally like a Tinuk Shenishba. Having said that again, he doesn't deal with consistent heresy. It's more also around the issue of Hilchos Shabbos. Now, here we come to an interesting halachic divide, because I'm now going to quote two poskim who are very much associated with the hashkafa, what we would say the hashkafa on the right. And the first is the Munkatscher Rebbe. The Munkatscher Rebbe is Reb Chaim Elazar Spiro. He was an author of a very important halachic work, the Minchas Elazar, and he led Munkatch Hasidus, which was virulently resistant to modernity, virulently anti-Zionist. We're talking back in the, he died in, before the Second World War, and died in the late 1830s. But part of the Hungarian Jewish leadership that, as we know, ended up very fragmented. Hungary ended up very, very fiercely anti-Zionist or very fiercely pro-Zionist. We're talking about his milieu is very, very much around the generation before the Satmar Rebbe, that sort of scene. And he speaks about the concept of Tunuk Shenishba, and he's bothered by the application of the Rambam. And he says that the do we know exactly to what degree the Rambam meant that the descendants of the Sadducees are not considered heretics? Is this only because they are separate to the religious community, or even if they're living amongst the religious community itself? Meaning to say, is the point of the Rambam because they've been brought up away from the Jewish community, even though amongst Jews, but from this splinter group, the Karaites or the Sadducees? But would this even apply if they're brought up in the mainstream community? After all, historically, and we know this very clearly from the Cairo Geniza, for example, the Karaites live very intermingled with the Jewish community. I guarantee you there's not a single Karaite kid that grows up in Cairo and Fustat in the lifetime of the Rambam who isn't aware that what they're doing is different to what their rabbinate, what we would call Orthodox friends and colleagues are doing. They're mixing with each other. They're not davening in the same shuls, but they are doing business together. They're communally under the same communal associations. And we know from the Cairo Geniza that even on occasion getting married together, and they have kesuvas in which the kesuva specifies how they're going to run their home in order to allow this marriage between an Orthodox and a man and a Karaite woman to work. So they're growing up in which they are absolutely aware of the environment around them. And the Minchas Elazar, therefore, is saying, to what degree is the Rambam, who's talking about Sadducees, talking about those who are growing up separate from the mainstream Jewish community, and brought up with the values of their own version of the faith? What about those who are actually intermingled and know all about this? And he says, the Minchas Elazar speaks about this and says that therefore one can't apply this view of the Rambam to those who grew up intermingled amongst the population. He said the Rambam is talking about the Sadducees, who grew up in completely separate communities, but those who are growing up within our communities and aware of the alternative view. This isn't a Tinuk Shenishba. A Tinuk Shenishba is someone who grows up oblivious, separate, societally apart from the rest of the Jewish community, and is unaware of the alternative view, unlike those who nowadays grow up irreligious, who are mingling and hearing the point of view, the alternative point of view. Now, the Chazon Ish, the leader of the founding father, really, of the new Yishuv's Haredi community, not the old Yishuv, but the new wave of Haredi immigrants to Israel, disagrees with this radically. And he says, even someone who's growing up in an environment of non-belief, but aware that there are Orthodox Jews out there, also falls under the rubric of the view of the Rambam, who says this person is a Tinuk Shenishba. And the reason he argues this is because they don't seriously consider the alternative version. It's not something that they ever investigate or take seriously. And therefore, says the Chazon Ish, this is legitimate to classify under the view of the Tinuk Shenishba of the Rambam, even though they are growing up intermingled with the religious community. So the Chazon Ish is arguing that the Rambam doesn't just mean someone who grows up. Again, so maybe I should just classify the different generations. The Rambam is talking about Sadducees. Sadducees grew up separate from the rabbinate community. The Minchas Elazar argues that this wouldn't apply, therefore, to those who grow up intermingled. The Chazon Ish argues even those who grow up side by side with their neighbors don't seriously consider their viewpoint, never genuinely weigh it up, and therefore shouldn't count as kofrim, as heretics in halachic terminology, unlike the distinction that the Minchas Elazar draws. Meaning to say as follows: let's take the most extreme formulation and the more subtle formulation. The most extreme formulation is, we live intermingled with people of all beliefs. For all we know, our neighbor 2 doors down is Hindu, our neighbor 6 doors down is Buddhist, we have a neighbor who lives opposite us who is Greek Orthodox, and another neighbor who is Muslim. To what degree do we seriously consider their beliefs? We're living intermingled, we are aware of the existence of an alternative belief, but we don't seriously investigate it. It's not something that we really weigh up and consider, most of us, most of the time, in our minds. Therefore, argues the Chazon Ish, the halachic principle of a Tinuk Shenishba doesn't just mean, in the thinking of the Rambam, someone who grows up literally in the jungle, someone who grows up literally removed from any awareness of Judaism. It can even apply to someone who grows up in the modern day state of Israel, aware that there's a very large body of Jews who radically disagree with their own views, nonetheless doesn't seriously contemplate it and consider it, and ever engage in genuine philosophical quest. So what we have here through the generations is a broadening of the category of Tinuk Shenishba. We have the early German poskim who say, Mechal Shabbos, normally taken as a sign of heresy, here isn't a sign of heresy. We have the Minchas Elazar who says, Tinuk Shenishba applies to one who's brought up irreligious, unless they're growing up interlinked with their neighbors. And then we have the Chazon Ish who says, even when you are growing up around and surrounded by your Orthodox neighbors, nonetheless, if you're not seriously considering their viewpoint, you never seriously engage with philosophical inquiry about it. One also doesn't count as a Tinuk, one also counts as a Tinuk Shenishba, and therefore is not qualified as a heretic. Now, what happens if we're dealing with someone who does grow up and seriously engage with it? And there are many Jews who either have grown up irreligious and genuinely investigate the views of believers, or Jews indeed who have grown up religious and choose after investigation to leave it.
Sorry, Rabbi Zobin, can I just ask before you move on to a different category?
Yes.
Do they all have the same view regarding a place in Olam Haba for these Tinuk Shenishba? They all take a view of Nebuch,
No, the Rambam is contrasting the Tinuk Shenishba in his Hilchos Mamrim, who he says it does not fall under the category of Nebuch and Apikoros, of the unwitting heretic. And the Londos, the logic of this would appear to be that this is, again, quite literally like a little baby. A little baby is not a non-believer, they are a believer. They just are never engaged with serious consideration of belief. And therefore, this isn't a non-believer, this is someone who just hasn't entered into that topic. And the argument of the Rambam is that this child who grew up as the descendant of the founding fathers of the Sadducee movement was just brought up like that, and therefore shouldn't be included in the category. The founding fathers of this heresy are, but not their descendants.
I understand, but do the rest follow that view as well? Those who hold Tinach and Nishba, it's streamlined throughout. It's okay, similar.
So I should have made this clearer. The answer is yes, but they're not. They're halachists. They're not interested in discussing the post the Rambam. The discussion around heresy moved away from Olam Haba, even though the two are linked, and moved to a pragmatic question of how do we, as believing Jews, relate to our brothers and sisters who are non-believers. And it became a halachic question rather than a theological question. The Rambam is interested in theology. Later generations turned away from this sort of theological speculation for two reasons. One is because they're less philosophically minded than the Rambam, and secondly because I think a consensus has arisen that not much is achieved by talking about who does and doesn't have a portion in the world to come. Who knows? It's complicated. It's philosophical. Let's leave that to God to decide. But we do need to know, as practical halachic decisors, what is the halachic status of these people? And it's more in that context that the Chazon Ish is talking. But the two align. It is correct that the two align. That the Chazon Ish is very philosophically aware. Anyone who reads his writing, he's got a philosophical work that he wrote, Emunah B'Tochon. He just doesn't see that as his primary role. His primary role is that of being a posek, a halachic decisor. But the two are aligned, and therefore, yes, the two would go together. Now, how, in the philosophical view of the Rambam, would such a non-believer have a portion in the world to come if they're not philosophically minded? It's the same question really about a baby. I mean, what about a baby that, God forbid, and tragically dies very young, or someone who doesn't have the mental capacity to consider these matters seriously? How would they have a portion to the world to come in the philosophical thinking of the Rambam? One can suggest various answers, including perhaps his Tichias HaMesim suggestion that that's one of the reasons people are reborn, to give them a chance then to develop their thoughts. But be that as it may, the Rambam is clear that these aren't the heretics I'm talking about. I'm not talking about people who are little babies. I'm not talking about people who never seriously considered this because they grew up completely oblivious to religious beliefs. The Chiddush of the Chazon Ish is he's talking about people who are not oblivious to religious beliefs. They know them well, very well. They're growing up intermingled with the religious population, and nonetheless, they fall under the category of Tinach and Nishba because they never seriously consider it. The Chazon Ish now makes a leap, which is a very important leap, to the next stage. So again, just so we're all clear, the order of the development of this thinking is as follows. Stage one, we have a Rambam who says, well, pre the Rambam, this issue isn't really that discussed. The Rambam argues that there are basic fundamentals that define what it means to be believing in Judaism. Nothing to do with fault. This isn't about blame. This isn't about guilt. This is just a fact. You either believe in Judaism or you don't believe in Judaism, a sort of existential reality. Number one. The Rambam also adds, however, that those who are oblivious to this discussion, the babies or child who is kidnapped and raised completely removed from the Jewish population, such a person is not a non-believer because they just haven't engaged seriously with belief at all. That's stage number two. Stage number three, therefore, is extending this to anyone who is a second or third generation Sadducee, who therefore grows up effectively removed from knowledge of orthodoxy. The Chazon Ish now extends it to someone who grows up very aware of orthodoxy, but never seriously considers it. This is stage number four. And we're now going to look at the option about what happens about someone who does seriously consider it. Someone here posted on the group, isn't the corollary that someone brought up, sorry, privately to me in chat, isn't the corollary that someone brought up in an orthodox way, was never really thought through about belief, even though he keeps mitzvahs, is not a believer. According to the Rambam, someone who grows up religious but never seriously thinks about the meaning behind mitzvahs is effectively also a Tinach and Nishba. That's exactly right. They're not a heretic. They've just never thought about it, and therefore is a type of Tinach and Nishba. Again, there's an argument between the Rambam and the Kabbalists around this point. Someone who performs a mitzvah completely unmindfully, without any any meaningful engagement with the ideas behind the mitzvahs. According to the Mekubalim, the mitzvahs have intrinsic existential spiritual value, which molds their neshama, their soul spiritually, and means that they are engaged in spiritual endeavors. The Rambam agrees that mitzvahs are meant to mold us, but believe that the molding that it does is consciousness forming. It's meant to form our minds and our whole way of thinking and relating to the world. And therefore, if we do mitzvahs oblivious to their inner meaning, they will have very little impact on us. So that's something, because the fact is we're doing something good, but that isn't the core of the mitzvah. The core of the mitzvah is how it changes how we think. So you are correct. The person who posed this question is correct, that someone who engages in Yiddishkeit all their lives without much inner awareness of it is very lacking in their performance of mitzvahs, according to everyone, but more so according to the Rambam. The Nevi'im, by the way, already railed against this, as we're well aware. Mitzvahs odom u'nomodah, lama li roiv zivcheichem. Why do I need all your karbonos when you're missing the purpose of mitzvahs? You're doing mitzvahs odom u'nomodah. You're just doing mitzvahs out of routine, without any thought, without yiras shamayim, without a connection to God in this. This is a perennial challenge in Judaism, which is so action-based. The plus side of action is that what we do is concretized. The downside of action is it ends up very it can end up very mechanical and by rote and without inner content. And according to the Rambam, yes, such a person who never engages in any insight into belief and thought about a meaningful connection to Hashem is an unformed person, is a person who hasn't really achieved that which the Torah wants us to think about. That is absolutely correct. Okay, stage number 5, the view of the Chazon Ish about someone who does meaningfully think about Judaism. And here the Chazon Ish says something remarkable. He says there are 2 clauses further to this halachic application of this. He says clause number 1 is, we need to live in a world in which the divine, the spiritual connection to the world is alive, is tangible, is visceral. If we live in a world in which the spiritual connection is not so, this isn't the heretic that we're talking about. Someone who is living in the Tanakh era, where prophets abound, where the word of God can be heard, where miracles are performed, such a person can be classified as a heretic if they choose to reject this. Someone who lives in today's world, we live in a world which sadly is very fragmented, a world which is very, it's very easy to miss the link between the secular operation of the world and its spiritual roots. Such a person, says the Chazon Ish, is not the kofar that the heretic that the halachic system is talking about. More than that, says the Chazon Ish, we can only define someone as a kofar if they have been given a genuine exposure to an alternative. Now, do we really know that there are people that know how to give that genuine exposure? What's been the life experiences of this person? Who has taught them about Yiddishkeit, if they grew up from? Who has taught them about Judaism if they didn't grow up religious, and then they made a serious investigation of it? Do we know what the agenda of the teachers and the kiruv people and the rabbinic leaders that they met was? Do we know whether when they rebuked them, and I don't mean rebuke in a tough way, but they tried to fulfill the mitzvah tichocho, which means drawing someone in and where necessary telling them off and proving to them, do we know what was going on there in the relationship, how transparent the relationship was, how pure the motives of the person who was doing this was? We don't know any of these things. And therefore, says the Chazon Ish, for 2 good reasons, we can't halachically classify someone as a kofar, because we don't really know. We don't know what spiritual experiences they had, and therefore whether they meaningfully could engage in this, and we don't know what their interactions were with the teachers who taught them. In other words, what Chazon Ish is saying is that you can live side by side with people with a different view, and you can know about their different view, and you can even engage in conversation with them, but never seriously consider the alternative. And if we're honest with ourselves, I'm not talking about matters of faith, I'm talking about all sorts of disagreements that we have. To break out of our sort of assumptions and our premises and our axioms is very, very difficult. And therefore, even someone who grows up and maybe grew up from or grew up irreligious and genuinely engaged with from people, we don't know that they are this is a serious consideration, and therefore halachically we're not allowed to consider them as heretics. What would be their halachic status? That we can leave up to, what would be their genuine status rather, that we can leave up to God. God would work out and understand their culpability, their responsibility, what their own individual life journey was. But we can't assume that such a person is a Kefira. So this is the Chazon Ish's version of stage 5. Even people who have meaningfully engaged, and even people who have grown up from, or perhaps grown up non-from, and then engaged meaningfully with their from neighbors or the from teachers of Torah and belief, nonetheless, we can't make any assumptions about them. Rav Amital, the late Rosh Hashiva of Gush, takes this really as his starting point, and he goes further. And he says when we are talking about post-Holocaust in particular, a world in which we've seen not just a rupture with spirituality, but we've seen things which seem at their core to just terribly conflict with every fiber of our being, with what we can bear to consider to be a spiritual world. Says Rav Amital, he thinks this whole conversation is one that needs to stop. He thinks this whole conversation is not a productive one. To begin playing with games of who is a believer and who isn't a believer in a world in which people have been through such difficult experiences. He says if before the war, the poskim in the 1920s and 1910s and 1930s are talking about these issues, he says post the war that it's time to shut down this this conversation. He says the very fact that such a large proportion of the Jewish world left the Derech Hashem has to make us pause for thought, and has to make us realize that what was going on in the last 100 years of Jewish history has been something completely different and remarkable and completely separate to that which the Rambam was talking about in the in his lifetime. He says, and this is a historical fact. If you look at the dropout rate in Jewish history through the generations, and the rate was very low. In meaning to say, there were Jews who were meaningfully engaged with their Judaism, there were Jews who were less meaningfully engaged with their Judaism. No doubt a significant percentage of Jews were mitzvahs adam l'mada, were just doing it because this is what they did, and this is what you do, and they weren't, philosophically particularly engaged or thinking about what they were doing. That presumably there was a significant percentage of people. But the reality is that the dropout rate, those who said consciously, this just isn't for me, is very, very low. We turn to the last 150 years of Jewish history. There's no doubt that the Orthodox, those who remained or chose to return to become strong believers or a minority. Says Rav Amital, he thinks this conversation, this historic fact, evidences that this isn't a productive halachic category at all. We can't make judgments at all about what leads people to become heretics. For all we know, someone can have grown up in the most rich and positive and beautiful from environment. Every encounter they had was only positive, and nonetheless ends up as a non-believer. Given everything that takes place in the world, we can understand where they're coming from. We don't need to reject them. So this is some of the developments of the poskim. However, I think there's a very, very important point that needs to be made here, and it's one that I'm only aware of having been made in fairly recent times, and it amazes me that this point wasn't discussed more significantly over the history of Jewish thought. And I really want to just conclude with this argument. I may be wrong, but to the best of my knowledge, the first person to put this position forward is of Shlomo Goren, who, as we know, was born in around the First World War, born in 1917, died in the 1990s. Chief Rabbi of, had a remarkable career, including being the Chief Rabbi of the Israeli Army, and later the Chief Rabbi of Israel. And he was a very, very significant Talmid Chacham, exceptionally controversial figure on many, many levels. Maybe another time I'll give a little talk about his life. He was a fascinating man and very, very complicated individual. But there's no doubt he was a staggering Gaon in Torah with a remarkable Talmid Chacham, really, of the first order. And he has a number of very important halachic works. And he points out something which deserves to have been said, and it's amazing that it wasn't said. And this is that there's a radical change in the formulation of the Rambam between what he writes in his Pirush Mishnayos, his commentary to Mishnayos, and what he writes in his Mishnah Torah. Now, you will often hear, and we will address this briefly next week, the claim that is made, which is that the Rambam writes his 13 principles of faith in his Perush Mishnayos. I mentioned when we started the series, the Rambam has 3 large works: his commentary on Mishnayos, his Mishnah Torah, and his Moreh Nevuchim. Now, there's no doubt, and then many smaller works, there's no doubt that his 2 senior works, as it were, is his Moreh Nevuchim, his Guide to the Perplexed, his senior philosophical work, and his Mishnah Torah, which is his halachic work. His commentary to Mishnayos, he was younger, and it's a commentary to Mishnayos, all said and done. It's a very important work. It's not his bottom line. It's not his final conclusion, which is what you would expect him to present in his philosophical work, the Moreh Nevuchim, or his Mishnah Torah. Now, in the Mishnah Torah that our claim is often made, he doesn't list the 13 principles of faith. This is incorrect. He does list them. There may be some tweaks. There's, for example, possibly a very important shift in his stance as to what he says exactly about Torah min Hashamayim. So there may be some tweaks, but broadly speaking, he does list his 13 principles of faith and he paskins them. The only point is he doesn't list them as an order, as 13 principles. He splits them up into their various sections. So in Hilchas Avodah Zarah, in the rules of idol worship, he'll write about non-belief in God's divinity and idolatry. In his Hilchas Yesod Torah, he'll write in Hilchas Teshuvah, he'll write about non-belief in reward and punishment, and so on and so forth. So he scatters his beliefs around his halachic work, because his halachic work is very systematically organized into topics. But he does very clearly paskin these principles of faith, and one can line them up more or less. So the Rambam in his halachic work does believe that this concept is relevant. However, there's a massive shift. In his Perush Mishnayos, in his commentary to the Mishnayos, he says you have to believe in these things in order to be a member of Klal Yisrael. And this has been summarized by the catechism that we say at the end of Davening. Many people say, Ani Mamin be'emunah shlema. I believe with absolute and perfect faith. However, in his Mishnah Torah, and I'll just read to you, by the way, the language that he uses in his commentary to the Mishnayos, just to bring out this point. The Rambam says, actually, I don't have his language, because but he says you have to believe positively as per the summary, Ani Mamin be'emunah shlema. However, in his Mishnah Torah, he doesn't say that. In his Mishnah Torah, he says that someone counts as a heretic if they declare, but that he doesn't mean speak, he means assert. They confidently know something contrary to one of the beliefs. So, for example, he says in Perek Gimel of his Hilchos Teshuvah, Haminim v'apikosim akofim, b'torah v'akofim b'tchias hamesim. He says, who is it who's a apikoros? Someone who's kofer b'tchias hamesim, someone who denies tchias hamesim. He doesn't say a kofer, a non-believer, is someone who doesn't know about tchias hamesim. In his commentary to Mishnayos, he says you have to believe in tchias hamesim, in order, the 13th principle of faith, the revival of the dead, in order to be within Yisrael, within this category of a Jewish believer. Or, for example, when he talks about minim means sectarians. For our purposes, a different form of heretic. Ha'omer she'ein shama loka, one who declares, that means confidently asserts, who knows there is no God. Or ve'ein lo olam manhig, that the world doesn't have a ruler, someone who manages it. Someone who declares that there is a creator to the universe, but they have a body. What about someone who says they don't know? Someone says, you know what, I'm not a philosopher. These things are too complicated for me. I don't know about these things. The Rambam in his Mishnah Torah very clearly does not say that such a person is a heretic. And this is pointed out by Rav Shlomo Goren, and I think this is it doesn't need my agreement, but I think this is an absolutely correct detail in the language of the Rambam. We spend so much of our time poring over the nuance of the text of the Rambam, and correctly so. The Rambam was a very, very careful writer, and he wrote with great precision. And if in his Mishnah Torah he writes that heresy is confident assertion, I think that's a very important point. Now, again, we should be believers. As Jews, we are absolutely meant to believe in the 13 principles of faith. This is not the point of this discussion. However, I began by saying that many of us can go through periods of wobbles. We can go through difficult experiences, and a thought can occur to us to the contrary. Maybe we go through a stage in our lives in which we are investigating, in which we're researching things. Maybe some of these principles we have doubts over. 2 points. Don't leave it. Research it. Investigate it. Look into it. This is what the Rambam and Halakha expects of us, no doubt. But equally, Rosh Hashanah tells us over here, this isn't what the Rambam was talking about. This isn't the halachic category of a heretic or a non-believer. It's one who asserts that as opposed to someone who has doubts. So basically what we have seen is, we've seen modern thinkers, more recent thinkers, who extends the category of Tanakh Shenishba, not just to the child who literally grows up oblivious in the jungle, not just as the Rambam extends it to the descendant of the Sadducees who have broken away, but even those who grew up intertwined, immersed in a religious environment. Certainly those who grew up knowing their neighbors are religious but never seriously converse with them, even those who grew up themselves from or have genuine engagement in conversation. There's increasing skepticism in the modern age about whether we can say such a person has genuinely and meaningfully considered the possibilities and rejected them, and therefore this person is still considered a tinuk. They're not considered a non-believer, they're considered an a-believer, someone who has never seriously weighed up the issues, because we live in such a confusing world to assume that someone has rejected it in a thought-through manner. Human beings are complex, and there's always other forces at work that lead us to form our judgment. That's one class of halachic direction. And a second class of halachic direction, to the best of my knowledge, really led only by Rosh Shlomo Goren, but which seems to be a very important diuk, nuance in the language of the Rambam, in which he points out that the Rambam speaks about someone who asserts non-belief, in other words, is confident of that in themselves, as opposed to someone who is doubtful. Now, there are those who are confident in non-belief, in which case Rosh Shlomo Goren's point wouldn't be relevant, but hopefully it's relevant for most people who are engaged in a spiritual journey. Hopefully for them, this is more about questioning rather than about rejection. So I'll stop there unless there are any questions on this point, and please, for next week, we'll try and look at the general area of midrashic literature and Agadic discussion, to what degree there should be halacha about this at all, which is the final criticism of the Rambam, which is whoever said philosophy has anything to do with halacha. But we'll look at that next week.
Shkar, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Have a good day, everyone. Thank you so much as always for joining.
Thank you very much.
I'll see you next week. Please, God.
Thank you very much.